Left with nothing at 14, Georgia had no family, just her mother's restless spirit watching over her. Her unseen guardian struck fear into anyone who hurt her. But as Georgia rose from tragedy to triumph, would her mother's spirit finally let go? In a small, quiet town, a family once lived in a modest home filled with dreams. Vivian, a loving wife and a mother, shared her beautiful bond with her husband, Peter, and their 10-year-old daughter, Georgia. Peter was a visionary, a man who dreamt of a bright future for Georgia. He often told Vivian, "Our daughter will change the world. She'll achieve things we can only dream of." But fate had other plans. One somber evening, as Peter laid in a hospital bed, his breath grew shallow. Vivian held his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face, as Georgia sat by the bed, clutching a book her father had given her. "Vivian," Peter whispered, his voice frail but determined, Promise me that you will make sure Georgia fulfills her potential. No matter what happens, make our dream for her a reality." Vivian, swallowing her sorrow, nodded firmly. "I promise, Peter, I won't let her down." With those words, Peter smiled faintly and took his last breath. His passing left a void, but also a burning resolve in Vivian's heart. Vivian became both mother and father to Georgia. She worked tirelessly, taking on multiple jobs to pay for Georgia's school fees and provide her with a stable life. Georgia, now 14, often watched her mother with admiration. "Mom, you don't have to work so hard," she would say, but Vivian always replied, "Your future is worth every effort, my dear." One day, Vivian began coughing, a persistent hacking cough that left her breathless. At first, she dismissed it as exhaustion, but it grew worse. Doctors diagnosed her with a severe illness. Despite her declining health, Vivian refused to stop working. One night, as she laid in bed, she called Georgia to her side. "Georgia, listen to me," she said, her voice weak but steady. "You are strong, my child. Whatever happens, promise me you'll never give up on yourself. Always remember that you're destined for greatness." Georgia, tears brimming in her eyes, held her mother's hand tightly. "I promise, Mom, I'll make you proud." Days later, Vivian passed away. Georgia, now an orphan, stood alone at the funeral, clutching a photograph of her parents. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, but she couldn't shake the overwhelming loneliness. Unknown to Georgia, Vivian's spirit lingered, bound by her promise to Peter. Vivian could not rest in peace. She became an unseen guardian watching over her daughter, determined to protect her from harm and ensure she stayed on the path of success. But life was harsh, with no relative to turn to. Georgia took a job as a live-in housekeeper, earning a small income to survive. Her employers often maltreat her, forcing her to do grueling tasks with little to no kindness. One day, as she scrubbed floors, her employer, a cruel woman, berated her. "You're useless. If you can't clean properly, don't expect to stay here." That night, strange things began to happen. Plates shattered inexplicably. Doors slammed on their own. The woman tripped down the stairs, narrowly avoiding serious injury. Terrified, she confronted Georgia. "You are cursed. Get out of my house." Georgia, confused and heartbroken, packed her belongings and left. Little did she know that her mother's spirit had retaliated on her behalf. This pattern repeated itself wherever Georgia went. Mistreatment was met with unexplainable accidents. People began to whisper about her, calling her bad luck and evil. Georgia started to believe she was truly cursed. At 17, Georgia found work at the home of Mrs. Ann, a kind and compassionate woman. Unlike her previous employers, Mrs. Ann treated Georgia with respect and care. "Tell me about yourself, dear," Mrs. Ann asked one evening. Georgia hesitated before opening up about her struggles. Mrs. Ann listened intently, her heart breaking for the young girl. "You deserve better, Georgia," Mrs. Ann said firmly. "I'll help you get back to school. You have so much potential." For the first time in years, Georgia felt hope. Mrs. Ann enrolled her in the same school as her children and encouraged her to dream again. Years passed and Georgia thrived under Mrs. Ann's care. She worked hard in school, excelling in her studies. Mrs. Ann treated her like family, and Georgia began to feel like she had found a home. One day, Mrs. Ann's son David returned from studying abroad. He was charming, intelligent, and immediately taken with Georgia. "You must be the famous Georgia my mom keeps talking about," David said with a smile. Georgia blushed but maintained her composure. Over time, their friendship blossomed into something more. After graduating as a mechatronic engineer, Georgia stood on stage, her heart swelling with pride as she received her degree. Mrs. Ann, David, and the rest of the family cheered her on. That night, as she slept, Georgia had a vivid dream. She found herself in a serene garden, bathed in soft light. Standing before her was her mother, Vivian. "Mom," Georgia whispered, tears streaming down her face. Vivian smiled, her presence warm and comforting. "My darling, I've been with you all along. Every time you were hurt, I protected you. Every time you were lost, I guided you. But now you are strong. You fulfilled your father's dream and found a family that loves you. I can finally rest." "No, don't leave me," Georgia pleaded, reaching out. "You don't need me anymore, Georgia," Vivian said gently. "You are everything we dreamed you would be. I love you, my child." As the dream faded, Georgia woke up with a sense of peace. Georgia and David eventually married in a small intimate ceremony. Mrs. Ann beamed with pride as she watched Georgia walk down the aisle, now a part of their family forever. Under the stars that night, Georgia whispered, "Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad. I hope I've made you proud." Somewhere beyond the veil, Vivian and Peter watched their spirits finally at peace.